Welcome everybody, my name is Robius and today I bring you another episode of Assassin's Creed, The Real History, the series where we compare the representations of characters and other elements depicted within one of the Assassin's Creed games to their actual history. Please be warned of major story spoilers ahead. For today's episode, we'll be exploring the history of the British cartographer, explorer, and navigator, Captain James Cook. To start, we will explore his early life during the pregame history, then we will cover his life in Assassin's Creed Rogue during the in-game history, and lastly we will summarize the differences between his actual life and his portrayal in the game. Starting with the pregame history, James Cook was born on October 27, 1728 in Marton, Yorkshire, to Scottish labourer James Cook and his wife Grace Pace. In 1736, the family moved, and Thomas Scotto, his father's employer, paid for 5 years of schooling until 1741, when James began working for his father, who was promoted to farm manager. In 1745, Cook moved to a fishing village where he worked as a grocer for a year and a half until the connections he made allowed him to become a merchant navy apprentice. During these 3 years of training, Cook also pushed himself to learn navigation, astronomy, geometry, and algebra, among other topics, with the purpose of further qualifying himself. He therefore passed his exams in 1752 and became a mate on the brig Friendship that year. Within 3 years, he was offered the command of the vessel, but turned it down to join the Royal Navy in mid-1755 as the growing threat of the 7 Years' War escalated. Joining the Navy, he began his career on the HMS Eagle as the master's mate. After a few successful confrontations, Cook eventually passed his master's examinations in June of 1757, which qualified him to navigate a vessel of his own. He soon after became the master of the HMS Pembroke, on which he served during the 7 Years' War in North America. It would be at this historical point where we first met Captain James Cook in Assassin's Creed Rogue, as the Templars aided him during the Battle of Louisbourg. Historically, Cook was involved in this amphibious assault, leading to the British capture of the French fortress. The captain soon after completed some surveying, with which he mapped the entrance of the St. Lawrence River. The maps he created played a large role in both the Siege of Quebec City and the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, both of which Cook participated in. In the following years, James Cook conducted extensive surveying around Newfoundland, eventually producing one of the most accurate maps of the island's coast, which used triangulation and hydrographic surveys, for which he was recognized by the Admiralty and Royal Society. In 1762, Cook married Elizabeth Batts, and together they had 6 children. In 1766, the Royal Society promoted Cook to lieutenant and had him record the transit of Venus across the Sun while in the Pacific, which began in August of 1768 in England and ended in April of 1769 in Tahiti. Experiencing only partial success, Cook continued to the second part of his mission, which had him search for the rich southern continent indicated to him under the name of Terra Australis. He started by mapping the New Zealand coastline, and then, in April of 1770, led the first European expedition to reach the eastern coastline of Australia. Here he made contact with an Aboriginal tribe and then continued his voyage. Unfortunately, he was delayed when his vessel, the Endeavour, ran aground on part of the Great Barrier Reef. Although they recovered from this, it took around 7 weeks to repair the ship. After reaching Possession Island, Cook claimed the coastline as British territory, and the voyage came to its eventual end on July 12, 1771, after returning to St. Helena. In August of the same year, Cook was again promoted, but this time to the rank of commander. Despite having mapped most of the eastern coastline of Australia, proving it to be the size of a continent, Cook was given the task of locating Terra Australis, which the Royal Society thought was a different landmass located even further south. Aboard the HMS Resolution and accompanied by the HMS Adventure, Cook's expedition was one of the first to cross the Antarctic Circle while circumnavigating the globe at a southern latitude. He nearly reached Antarctica's mainland, but instead returned to Tahiti to resupply. He continued to search for the non-existent second continent, eventually visiting the Friendly Islands and Easter Island, among other locations, during his return to New Zealand in 1774. Prior to returning to England, he mapped and claimed for Britain South Georgia. Upon his return, his reports and extensive travels proved that there was in fact not a separate southern continent. For his work, he was made a post captain and received an honorary retirement from the Royal Navy, later becoming an officer at the Greenwich Hospital. After receiving even more awards and honors from various institutes, Cook volunteered for a voyage with the goal of locating the Northwest Passage. This time, Cook once again commanded the HMS Resolution and was accompanied by the HMS Discovery. Their first goal was to return one of the islanders, Omai, who had helped them on their previous voyage, back to his home in Tahiti. In 1778, Cook was the first European to make contact with the Hawaiian Islands during these travels, which he named the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He then headed northward along the west coast of North America, eventually reaching Vancouver Island, where they remained for a month trading with the natives. They then continued their voyage, reaching the Bering Strait and finding it impassable after many attempts. Despite this failure, Cook succeeded in mapping most of the northwest coast of North America and was able to complete the unmapped areas left by the Spanish in the south and the Russians in the west. In 1779, Cook and his men returned to Hawaii and located the largest island of the archipelago. They arrived on the island at the same time as a Hawaiian harvest festival, which was taking place to worship the god Lono. In reason of the HMS Resolution's massed formations, and the way that they circled the island before landing, it has been argued by some that the locals may have seen Cook as an incarnation of the god, which would be the reason he has been historically deified by the culture. However, this theory is not fully confirmed. Remaining in Hawaii for around a month, Cook then prepared to continue exploring the northern Pacific. However, after the HMS Resolution's foremast broke, he returned to the islands. Unfortunately, in the time that followed, tensions arose between the Hawaiians and the Europeans, bordering on violence due to items being stolen. Cook planned to trick the King of Hawaii to hold him hostage as a way of remedying these issues. On February 14, 1779, he entered the village and led the king, who followed him willingly, towards his ship. One of the king's wives and a priest tried to convince him that Cook was his enemy and that he should not go with him. As they neared the shore, a large crowd formed, and when Cook turned to begin launching their boats to return to the Resolution, he was hit in the back of the head by a chief and stabbed to death as he fell to the ground. Multiple other Marines were also killed and injured during this confrontation. Despite this killing, as they still respected him, the Hawaiians gave Cook a funeral equivalent to one of their chiefs and later returned his remains to his crew, who buried him at sea. In summary, James Cook only made a few appearances in Assassin's Creed Rogue during the 2-year period of the 7 Years' War that was depicted, and therefore there aren't many differences between his in-game history and his actual history. First, although he was not a member of the Templar Order in the game, it's safe to assume that he wasn't actually one of their unwitting allies. Second, in association with the previous point, he did not help locate any people, like Adewale or Chevalier, and was instead more of an explorer, cartographer, and navigator, as opposed to an informant. Lastly, Cook's maps were not influenced by any of Louis-Joseph Gauthier de la Vérendrye's, as was somewhat implied in Rogue when Shea gave them to him. Aside from these minor differences, Cook's short representation in the game was rather well done, as it tracked his participation in the 7 Years' War and even included some great tidbits concerning his later voyages. For example, I enjoyed how he mistook the Templars for being members of the Board of Admiralty, for which he would later be employed, and how Shea mentioned they would be sponsoring some of his future voyages in reason of all the help he offered.
Tell me the truth. Are you fellows with a larger organization? The Board of Admiralty. You take your orders directly from His Majesty, don't you?
We couldn't tell you, even if we were.
You should have these maps. De la Vérendrye won't need them anymore. We'll contact you in regards to sponsoring future voyages, Captain.
Much obliged.
Overall, both in terms of direct representation and in terms of references to his later accomplishments, I believe that Captain James Cook was greatly depicted in Assassin's Creed Rogue. With that final fact, we have finished another episode of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, I highly recommend you try out one of the Assassin's Creed games. Thank you all for watching. Please leave any suggestions for future characters, groups, events, or locations from any of the Assassin's Creed games that you'd like me to cover in the comment section below. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you all in a future historical episode.